Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here to talk about something that's not impeachment. It's really delightful. I'm Mieke Eoyang. Here's how you can find me if you are interested in my opinions on other things, including cyber. So in May of 2019, the city of Baltimore was hit by a cyber attack for the second time. They found their emergency services shut down for 17 hours. They had to start responding to things manually, while a hacker demanded that they pay 13 Bitcoin in order to, nearly $80,000, in order to be able to get the ransom, or their data would be deleted forever. Like thousands of cities across the country, Baltimore decided not to pay the ransom, but instead to try and fix the problem themselves, and they spent millions in remediation. But in Baltimore, what we discovered is that the exploit that was used, or they kicked off a debate about whether or not the exploit that was used to target Baltimore was actually one developed by the NSA as part of their a series of exploits that was stolen by the shadow brokers. So Baltimore started blaming NSA, NSA started blaming Baltimore, saying, you guys didn't patch. Baltimore was like, you guys shouldn't be developing these offensive tools. You had these accusations flowing up and down the BW Parkway. But in this conversation, as we're throwing blame on both sides, we're leaving out the one person who is unquestionably to blame here. The individual who is sitting there waiting for the Bitcoin to flow into their wallet. We're not thinking about the individual behind the attack. Sadly, Baltimore's story is all too common. It's replicated in thousands of cities and businesses across the country. And we continue to blame users for not avoiding clicking on every phishing link, for operators for not updating and patching promptly, for developers for having exploitable vulnerabilities in their code. When a cyber crime or breach becomes public, the response all too often is to blame the victim. It is the digital equivalent of, that was a mighty short firewall you were wearing. And in blaming the victim, we are focusing on defending systems over identifying, pursuing, and bringing to justice the human behind the cybercrime. This defense-focused strategy has been with us for so long, we've almost forgotten where it's come from. It's an assumption that sort of underlies the whole field of cybersecurity. It's inherent in the name cybersecurity. Why is that? Well, nearly a decade ago, when I was serving on the House Armed Services Committee, I handled the cybersecurity portfolio, which I know may seem surprising to you that I am not a technical person, but there it was. And my job was to try and explain to members of Congress what was going on and what the government was doing in cybersecurity. Then the Bush administration proposed this thing called the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, which was focused on creating a front line of defense in cybersecurity, but frankly was really just a grab to try and put endpoint detections on all the private sector networks. We were concerned about it, we scaled it back. They focused then on protecting government networks and increasing education and outreach to people on cybersecurity, protecting critical infrastructure, things like that. But that CNCI and its focus helped define the government's cybersecurity approach for decades to come. But it doesn't have to be that way. If we think of cybersecurity along two different axes, defense and offense, system and human, the CNCI and most of our talk about cybersecurity is in the quadrant that it's in system and defense. We talk about how we secure systems. We think about patching. We think about updating. We think about supply chain. We think about secure codes. We are thinking about how do we secure the system itself from the malicious actor. A focus on system and defense, while necessary, is by no means sufficient, right? There are a whole bunch of other places where security can fail. So we also started thinking about defense and human. How do you make the user a more savvy operator here, not to click on the link, stop using password as your password? I'm sure everyone has somebody in their office like this. I certainly do. But if your security depends on humans to be perfect 100% of the time, it's designed to fail. So then we started thinking about system and offense, right? This whole debate about hack back. Should we go on to the attacker's network? Should we deny them access to their tools? Should we take down botnets? I went to law school just down the street. The lawyer in me says, hey, look, I could really never recommend to anyone that they go onto a third party's network and start taking offensive action. The liability risk, just too great. So I could never recommend that. There are people who engage in offensive activities in other places. But even then, to engage in offensive activity, to be able to take down the domains that the attacker uses, still leaves the attacker free and at liberty to think about new tactics and to come back at you again in ways that you weren't anticipating. They, the human, are still at large. So what are we doing about this last quadrant, about human and offense? What are we doing to find, locate, and hold accountable that human attacker? Because let's be clear, all the 0 days in the world don't matter unless a human being exploits them for malicious activity. Whose responsibility is it to go after that human? Now look, I spend a lot of time on the intelligence community, and let me just tell you, all those guys up there at Cyber Command and NSA and the military, they are really eager to think about this question. And they sit around spending a lot of time thinking about what is the big one, what is the cyber 9/11 that will allow them to kick over into the cyber war. But for most of the malicious activity that we see today, taking a militarized approach to dealing with the human leads you to some pretty extreme places, right? I just don't think it's appropriate that the response to someone setting up a fake Twitter account or selling credit cards online is to launch a drone strike. But since I've left the Intelligence Committee over a decade ago, the volume of cyber attacks have only increased. It's not just limited to stealing intellectual property or people's data. Since then, we've seen people stealing millions of dollars out of the Federal Reserve account in the Bank of Bangladesh. We've seen major international shipping companies crippled, dead in the water as a result of ransomware attacks. We've seen healthcare systems unable to process patient responses because their systems are locked down. We've seen essential services in cities across this country locked up by ransomware attacks. And we've seen around the world attacks on critical infrastructure, interruptions in power plants and power supply, and even the casinos of Sheldon Adelson. Thank you very much, Iran. But these are the attacks that make the news. The vast majority of attacks that we see are not actually that big, right? You guys everyone has these attacks of $1 on your iTunes account, $5, $50, $500, $50,000 stolen out of people's bank accounts. Those things don't even register anymore, right? But why not? One check carding scam in the United States netted more in a single day than every in-person bank robbery in the United States that year combined. But where are we putting our resources, right? We are ignoring this. So while NSA and Cyber Command sit around waiting for the big one, we do have federal agencies that are empowered right now to do something about the human attacker, and the question is, are they, right? The FBI, the Secret Service, San Francisco PD, NYPD. There are organizations that have the ability and the authority to begin investigations into these cybercrime cases and be able to bring indictments against people. We've seen a few of them. But sadly, in most law enforcement jurisdictions, if you try and come in with, we've heard this from people who've tried to come in and report their cybercrimes, they're told it didn't happen in our jurisdiction, it happened on the internet, so we can't take your complaint. Well, I'm sorry, if someone could point me to the internet police, then I would be delighted to go there and report the crime, but crimes happen to people in geographic jurisdictions. We need to figure out how to do this. So, but when we think about this, when we think about sort of the big crimes and the little crimes, how big a volume of crime are we asking law enforcement to take on? Well, we have a massive undercount problem. In 2018, the FBI received nearly 350,000 reports of cybercrimes. Seems like a lot, and one incident can encompass many different individuals. But the FBI estimates that their undercount is off by a factor of 10. which would mean you'd have 3.5 million estimated incidents. But what we found in looking at numbers on this is that Gallup had done a survey and asked people, has your household been hit by a cybercrime? And they predominantly meant some kind of financial fraud. And what they found was that nearly 1 in 4 households had been hit by some kind of cybercrime, making it the most prevalent form of crime in the United States, which would lead you to a total of, going back, nearly 31.5 million cybercrimes in the United States. What that means is we are in the middle of a cybercrime wave and nobody is talking about it. But part of the problem is not only are we in the middle of a hidden crime wave, but we have a hidden enforcement crisis. Look, the data is hard on this, and I will admit it. It animated. I didn't think it was going to do that. One of my researchers went back and he looked at all the data. And it's really hard because not everything is reported, and it's hard to match incidents against law enforcement activity. But what he found was that for every 1,000 reported incidents, we only saw an arrest in 3 of them. So not only is this the most prevalent form of crime in America, it is also the least enforced crime in America. But that's off of reports of crimes that we know about. As I said, the FBI's undercount could be as high as 1 in 100. They could be off by a factor of 2, which means that it's not actually 3 in 1,000. Could be as high as 3 in 100,000. And I'm sorry if that's convinced some of you to change career fields. Now, look, we think that this is unacceptable. We don't think that digital criminals should be able to operate with such impunity given the state of analog law enforcement today. And we recognize that solving this problem is hard. We've heard from law enforcement, look, there's no way to figure out who these attackers are. They hide their identities. They're operating through encrypted services. Or even if we figure out who they are, they're in a place where we can't get access to them. Right? They're harbored in St. Petersburg, and we're not getting them turned over to us. We've heard about a lack of trained law enforcement personnel. And we've seen over and over again that as soon as someone builds up some expertise in this area, they're hired away to the private sector to do security for major corporations at nearly 3 times their government salary. So it's really hard to keep the expertise in-house. We've heard about a lack of resources for attribution and a lack of technology. A lack of knowledge from law enforcement about what data they can ask for and what data is available to them from companies as they investigate these crimes. And we've heard about the challenges of geography, right? All too often the victim and the perpetrator are in different countries, and a lot of law enforcement agencies are just not that capable at helping turn over or investigate cybercrimes against people in their jurisdictions. But it's not impossible, right? There are a few successes. Alexei Burkov pled guilty last week to carding scams and could face up to 15 years in jail. He's not the only one. Some of you may have read the great Wall Street Journal story about the couple who shut down the security cameras in Washington, D.C., the surveillance cameras 3 days before Trump's inauguration. The FBI found them because the guy used an email address on his Amazon account that they used to trace it. He used it to buy a literal smoking gun. So look, some criminals are stupid and we can catch them, but also we need to be better at investigating these kinds of crimes, and it's not impossible. This is why over the past year, we at Third Way have set about to understand this enforcement gap, why it exists, and how we can close it. In our first major report, To Catch a Hacker, this is a screenshot of the webpage, I have copies if you want actual paper. We laid out 3 major policy areas where we think we need more attention and focus in order to make progress in closing the law enforcement gap. We need to strengthen domestic law enforcement. And there we identified 4 areas. We need to rebalance resourcing in this area so that law enforcement has the resources that it needs to be able to actually investigate these crimes. Now people have said to me, and look, there's plenty of money over on the military side. I used to do budgets. Like, the FBI would choke to death trying to absorb the amount of money in the NSA's couch cushions. There's just a lot of money out there. Second, we need to build a cyber-capable law enforcement workforce. We need to invest more in the training of law enforcement so they know what to ask for, they know how the systems work. Law enforcement officers, they graduate from Quantico, they know how to take fingerprints, but do they know how to do a reverse whois lookup? Do they even know where to begin collecting forensics in a cybercrime case? We think that this is an overlooked area that is very specialized in the FBI and not something that they all need to know, that they all know about. Third, we need better attribution efforts. The FBI and DOJ cannot keep asking the technology community for exceptional access to encryption as a way of solving their problems. This is not the only thing that stands in their way of investigating these crimes. There are other things that they can be doing. They don't even know how to write a proper request to a lot of the technology companies to be able to ask for the data that they can give. They can get a lot of metadata. They don't know how to ask for it. They don't know how to use it. They don't know how to process it. Before they come and ask us to weaken encryption for everyone, let's focus on the things, the low-hanging fruit that they can do. Fourth, we need a carrot and stick approach to fugitives, right? There are a lot of people who are outside the United States. We need to think about sanctions, the same kinds of tools that we used against terrorist financing networks, and rewards. We offered $15 million for Osama bin Laden. We can offer money for the apprehension of cybercriminals. And we don't use that tool nearly enough. But even if we improved all of our domestic law enforcement agencies, we'd still need to make improvements in international cooperation and diplomacy in order to make this work, because we don't have agreement internationally about what cybercrime looks like and how to prosecute this. And you see this playing out in real time at the UN, where Russia and China are advancing a new cybercrime treaty that does not actually focus on cybercrime, but could really undermine internet freedoms and allow them to prosecute more dissidents around the world. We need to think about what we really mean when we're talking about cybercrime and what the malicious activity is, and try and reach some agreement about the things that really harm people. And we need a national strategy and political leadership on this issue, because a lot of these problems are interagency, State Department and FBI, right? FBI and NYPD. We need to figure out how to communicate across agencies, and that only happens if you have political leadership at the top. Now, I am not optimistic that that political leadership exists at the moment, but I am really hopeful that in a few months we might have a change in that leadership and someone who is able to actually build and sustain a comprehensive plan to address this problem. Look, but mostly we have found that the biggest obstacle to making progress in this area is a sense of futility that anything can be done to solve the problem. That all of these barriers individually make people feel like, well, you can't do this unless you solve that. And there's a real sense that, like, there is nothing to be done and we are just gonna have to live with the volume of attacks that continue to hit us every day. Maybe we can't solve all of it. Look, no one's saying crime is gonna go to zero. But there are many things that we can do working together that make a difference in small ways, and in those small ways add up to big change. Because there's no reason why, when someone is the victim of a cybercrime, that crime goes unpunished and they never see justice. With that, thank you.